Hi, and welcome to the Archive of History. It is the hour before dawn, and you are standing among ruins. The stone beneath your feet is ancient, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that came before yours. Around you, broken columns rise like skeletal fingers reaching toward a sky slowly turning from black to deep purple. The air is thin here, cold in that particular way that only high mountain places know. You can hear nothing but the wind moving through the gaps in the marble, a sound like breathing, like the earth itself is exhaling the memory of what once stood here. This is Delphi. This is the center of the ancient world, the place where mortals came to hear the voice of a god. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. The ruins around you are not just stones. They are the physical remnants of belief, of pilgrimage, of power that shaped empires and decided the fate of nations. For nearly 1,000 years, this sacred place on the slopes of Mount Parnassus was considered the most important religious site in the Greek world. Kings and peasants alike climbed these mountains to ask questions of the oracle, to seek wisdom from Apollo himself through his priestess, the Pythia. The answers they received, cryptic and strange, changed the course of history. Wars were fought or avoided based on the prophecies spoken here. Colonies were founded in distant lands because the oracle blessed the voyage. Philosophers came here and saw inscribed upon the temple walls the maxims that would shape Western thought. Know thyself. Nothing in excess. This was more than a sanctuary. It was a meeting place of the mortal and divine where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Tonight we will walk through these ruins together. We will climb the sacred way as countless pilgrims did before us, passing treasuries and monuments, ascending toward the great temple of Apollo where the oracle sat in darkness and spoke in riddles. We will feel the weight of the stones, smell the incense that once burned here, hear the hymns that echoed through the theater carved into the mountainside. We will stand in the stadium where athletes competed for crowns of laurel in games second only to Olympia. We will try to understand what it meant to live in a world where divine prophecy was not myth but accepted reality, where a journey to this remote mountain sanctuary could determine the fate of your city, your family, your soul. And we will trace the long, slow arc of decline from sacred center of the Greek world to abandoned ruins buried under a medieval village, and finally to the archaeological marvel that tourists visit today, searching for some echo of ancient wisdom among the fallen marble. Now let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let go of your daily concerns, your tasks and obligations. You are standing on a mountainside in Greece, surrounded by stones that have outlasted empires. The dawn is coming. The light will soon touch these ruins as it has for thousands of years, indifferent to the rise and fall of civilizations. Settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us walk together through time into the sacred heart of ancient Delphi. Our journey begins not with the ruins as they are today, but with the landscape itself, the physical place that made this site so powerful, so impossible to forget. The landscape here is not gentle. Mount Parnassus rises more than 8,000 feet above the Gulf of Corinth, its twin peaks often lost in clouds, covered in snow through much of the year. The mountain was sacred long before Apollo claimed it, revered as the home of the Muses, those divine spirits who inspired poets and musicians. Even today, standing among the ruins, you can feel why the ancients believed gods walked here. The scale of everything is enormous. The cliffs drop away in sheer faces of grey and russet stone. Eagles circle overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. The rocks are split by crevices where winter storms have worked for millennia, carving the mountain into fantastic shapes. In certain lights, the stone seems to glow, taking on colors from deep gold to violet, depending on the angle of the sun. This is a place of beauty and terror, of grandeur that makes human concerns feel very small. The sanctuary of Delphi sits on a natural terrace on the southern slopes of the mountain, about 2,000 feet above the valley below. If you stand at the edge of the ruins and look south, the view opens up in a way that steals your breath. The valley of the Pleistos River spreads out beneath you, a patchwork of olive groves whose silver-green leaves shimmer in any breeze. The trees here are ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, some of them descendants of the very groves that provided oil for the sanctuary lamps 2,000 years ago. Beyond the valley, perhaps 10 miles distant, you can see the waters of the Gulf of Corinth, that narrow arm of sea that separates the Peloponnese from central Greece. On clear days, the mountains on the far shore are visible, blue and hazy with distance. This is a landscape of layers, of depth and perspective, the kind of view that invites contemplation. It is easy to imagine standing here and feeling connected to something larger than yourself, to the sweep of history and geography, to the movement of seasons and centuries. But turn back toward the mountain, and the feeling changes. Here the landscape is more enclosed, more immediate. The ruins cluster on a slope that rises steeply upward. Behind them, the cliffs of Mount Parnassus loom like walls, creating a natural amphitheater. Two great rock formations tower over the site. The ancients called them the treasuries, the shining ones, named for the way sunlight reflects off their bare stone faces. Between these twin cliffs, a spring emerges from the rock. This is the Castalian Spring, one of the most sacred elements of the entire sanctuary. The water here is cold and pure, flowing year-round regardless of season. It has carved a deep cleft in the mountainside, creating a narrow gorge where the rock faces rise vertically on either side. The spring was essential to the oracle. Every pilgrim who came to consult the Pythia had to purify themselves first in these waters. They would strip and stand beneath the flow, washing away the dust of travel, the impurities of the mundane world, preparing themselves spiritually and physically to enter the presence of the god. Even now, the spring still flows. If you put your hand in the water, you will feel how cold it is, how it numbs your fingers in seconds. The ancient Greeks believed this water had special properties, that it could inspire and purify, that it carried something of the divine down from the heights of Parnassus. Modern analysis shows it is simply mountain snowmelt filtered through layers of limestone. But stand there in the narrow gorge, with the cliffs rising on either side and the cold water rushing past your feet, and you might understand why they believed otherwise. There is something about this place that feels set apart, different from the ordinary world. Perhaps it is just the isolation, the dramatic geology, the play of light on stone. Or perhaps there is something more, something that cannot be measured but only felt. The site itself, the ruins we have come to explore, occupies a space that feels almost suspended between earth and sky. It is not on the valley floor where life is easy and level ground abundant, nor is it on the mountain's summit, inaccessible and remote. Instead, it clings to this intermediate zone, this sloping terrace where the mountain begins its serious climb. Building here required enormous effort. Every stone had to be cut and shaped and hauled up from quarries below. Every column, every statue, every treasury building represented not just wealth, but also the determination to create something lasting in a place where nature constantly works to reclaim its space. The earthquakes are common here. The whole region sits on active fault lines. The ancients knew this. They experienced devastating quakes that toppled buildings and split the ground. Yet they rebuilt again and again because the location itself was too important to abandon. The oracle had spoken from this place. Apollo had claimed this sanctuary. No amount of geological violence could change that fundamental truth. The climate here is extreme in ways that lowland Greeks would have found challenging. In summer, the sun beats down on the pale stone, reflecting heat until the air shimmers. There is little shade among the ruins. The earth turns hard and dusty, cracked from the heat. But even in summer, the nights are cool. The mountain breathes cold air down into the sanctuary once the sun sets. You can feel the temperature drop, feel the chill creeping up from the stones. In winter, the site transforms entirely. Snow covers the ruins, softening their outlines, muffling sound. The wind howls through the columns, bitter and relentless. Ice forms on the marble, making the ancient paths treacherous. For months the sanctuary would have been nearly inaccessible, the oracle silent, the pilgrims gone. Only the permanent residents would remain, the priests and attendants who maintained the site, waiting for spring when the roads would open again and the suppliants would return, climbing the mountain with their questions and their offerings. Spring and autumn are the gentlest seasons here, and they would have been the busiest times for the oracle. In spring, the mountain comes alive with wild flowers. Poppies bloom red among the rocks. Herbs like thyme and oregano scent the air. The Castalian Spring runs fuller with snowmelt. The olive groves in the valley below put out new leaves, that particular fresh green that seems to glow in the Mediterranean sun. In autumn, the air turns crisp and clear. The light takes on a golden quality, less harsh than summer. The grapes ripen in the valley vineyards. The first rains softened the parched earth. These were the seasons when pilgrims would make their journeys, when the roads were passable and the weather kind enough for travel. They would arrive dusty and tired from days or weeks of walking, and the first thing they would see would be this view, this impossible location where human ambition and sacred geography met. Understanding this landscape is essential to understanding Delphi. The sanctuary did not achieve its importance despite its remote location. It achieved importance because of it. The difficulty of reaching this place, the drama of the setting, the sense of standing at the edge of the world where mountains meet sky, all of this contributed to the awe pilgrims felt. When you had walked for days to get here, when you had purified yourself in the icy spring, when you stood on the terraces and looked out at that vast view of valley and sea, you were already in a state of heightened awareness. You were ready to believe that this was a place where God spoke to mortals. The landscape itself was part of the oracle's power. It prepared you, humbled you, opened you to the possibility of divine communication in a way that no lowland sanctuary ever could. But how did this place become sacred? What drew the first pilgrims here, long before the temples were built, before the oracle achieved its fame? To understand that, we must turn to the myths, the stories the ancient Greeks told about the origins of Delphi. These stories are not history in the modern sense. They are something older, deeper, the way a culture explains to itself why certain places feel charged with meaning, why certain spots on the earth seem to hold power that others do not. The myths of Delphi are layered, contradictory, full of violence and transformation. They speak of older gods displaced by newer ones, of monsters slain and oracles established, of a sacred site that existed before Zeus himself ruled on Olympus. The oldest stories say that Delphi belonged first to Gaia, the earth herself. She was the original oracle here, speaking prophecies from a cleft in the rock. Her voice rose up from the depths of the earth, from the womb of creation, carrying wisdom that predated civilization. Pilgrims would come and listen to the earth's breathing, interpreting the sounds that emerged from the rock as divine communication. This was an oracle of primal forces, of generation and fertility, of the deep mysteries that govern growth and decay. The site was guarded by a great serpent, a dragon called Python. This creature was enormous, spawned from the mud after the great flood that Zeus sent to destroy the Bronze Age of humanity. Python coiled around the rocks, protecting the sacred chasm, serving the earth goddess who had been here since the beginning of time. Then Apollo came. Apollo, the young god, beautiful and terrible, archer and musician, bringer of plague and healing both. He had been born on the sacred island of Delos, son of Zeus and the titaness Leto. As a young god, still nearly an infant by divine standards, he sought a place to establish his own oracle, his own sanctuary where mortals could come and hear his will. He wandered through Greece, searching, rejecting site after site until he came to the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Here he found what he sought, but the place was occupied. Python ruled here, the great serpent, ancient and powerful, guardian of Gaia's oracle. Apollo did not negotiate. He did not ask permission. He drew his silver bow, the weapon that never missed, and he killed Python with his arrows. The battle is described in ancient hymns as fierce and bloody. The serpent writhed in its death throes, its blood soaking into the earth, staining the rocks. But Apollo was victorious. He took the site as his own. Yet even in victory, Apollo owed a debt to the past. The killing of Python, though justified in the god's own eyes, was still a murder. It was violence done to an ancient sacred thing. So Apollo had to purify himself. The myth says he went into exile for a year, wandering in distant lands, serving penance for the blood he had shed. When he returned to Delphi, cleansed and ready to claim his sanctuary, he established games in Python's honor. These would become the Pythian Games, athletic and musical contests held every 4 years, second only to the Olympics in prestige. And he named his priestess, the one who would speak his prophecies, the Pythia, as a permanent reminder of the serpent who had died here. Even the sacred tripod she sat upon when delivering oracles was said to be positioned over the exact spot where Python's body had fallen, where his blood had seeped into the earth. The new order honored the old, incorporated it, acknowledged that even divine power must pay respect to what came before. There is another version of the founding myth, one that speaks not of Python but of an earlier oracle belonging to Themis, the titaness of divine law and order, or to Phoebe, another titan associated with prophecy. In this telling, the oracle passed peacefully from the older generation of gods to the younger, from the titans who ruled before Zeus to the Olympians who came after. Apollo received Delphi as a gift or perhaps an inheritance, taking his rightful place in a succession of oracles stretching back to the beginning of time. This version is less violent, more orderly, but it carries the same essential message that Delphi was old, older than Apollo, a place of prophecy from time immemorial. The myths also tell us how Apollo chose the exact location for his temple. He transformed himself into a dolphin, Delphis in Greek, and leaped onto a Cretan ship sailing through the Gulf of Corinth. The sailors, terrified and amazed, followed the dolphin as it led them to shore. Then Apollo revealed himself in his true form, radiant and beautiful, and commanded the Cretans to become his first priests. He led them up the mountain to the sacred terrace where Python had died, and there he showed them where his temple would stand. This myth explains why the place was called Delphi and why Cretans held special positions in the sanctuary's early administration. It also emphasizes the god's direct involvement in establishing his oracle, his hands-on approach to claiming this sacred space. At the very center of the sanctuary, in the innermost chamber of Apollo's temple, there was a stone. The Greeks called it the omphalos, the navel. It was a rounded stone, often depicted with a net of carved lines crisscrossing its surface, and it represented the center of the world. The myth explaining this stone is one of the most famous associated with Delphi. Zeus, wanting to locate the exact center of the earth, released two eagles from opposite ends of the world. They flew toward each other, and where they met marked the precise midpoint of creation. That spot was Delphi. The omphalos stone marked it, anchored it, made it visible and permanent. Pilgrims who came here were not just visiting another temple in another Greek city, they were coming to the center of everything, the axis around which the world turned. The prophecies spoken here carried weight not just because Apollo spoke them, but because they came from the center, from the place where earth met sky, where the divine order was most clearly visible. These myths did more than explain Delphi's origins. They shaped how people experienced the site. When you climbed the sacred way and approached the temple, you were walking in Apollo's footsteps, following the path the god himself had walked when he first claimed this mountain. When you heard the oracles speak, you were hearing words that emerged from the same chasm where Gaia once spoke, where Python's blood had consecrated the ground. When you looked at the omphalos stone, you were seeing the marker of creation's center, the point around which all else revolved. The myths turned a physical location into sacred geography, a place where every stone, every spring, every view carried layers of meaning that went back to the beginning of time. The transition from Gaia's oracle to Apollo's was not complete erasure. The old goddess was never entirely forgotten. Some sources suggest that the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, still invoked Gaia in her prayers, still acknowledged the earth's priority in this sacred space. The oracle's power came from below, from vapors rising through a fissure in the rock, from the earth's depths. This was Gaia's realm. Apollo might speak through his priestess, but the medium itself, the very mechanism of prophecy, belonged to the older order. The myths encoded this layered history, this sense that Delphi was a palimpsest of belief, where newer gods wrote their stories over older ones without completely erasing what came before. To visit Delphi was to enter a place where time worked differently, where past and present existed simultaneously, where the voices of multiple ages of the world could be heard if you listened carefully enough. Understanding these myths is essential to understanding what Delphi meant to the ancient Greeks. This was not just a temple where priests performed rituals, it was the living embodiment of their deepest stories about how the world worked, how gods and mortals interacted, how divine will manifested in physical space. The very rocks here were characters in cosmic dramas. The spring water carried the memory of ancient purifications. The temple stood on ground soaked with Python's blood, marked as the world's center, touched by the god himself. When pilgrims climbed the mountain and entered the sanctuary, they were stepping into myth made real, into a landscape where the boundary between story and history dissolved. They came seeking prophecy, yes, but they also came seeking connection to something older and larger than themselves, to stories that had shaped their civilization since before anyone could remember. The myths of Delphi were not separate from its function as an oracle. They were integral to it, providing the narrative framework that made prophecy believable, powerful, capable of changing the course of human events. Now we come to the heart of Delphi's power. The reason pilgrims traveled here from all corners of the Greek world and beyond. We come to the oracle herself, the Pythia, the priestess who sat in Apollo's temple and spoke prophecies that kings and emperors obeyed. To understand what made Delphi so influential for so many centuries, you must understand her, how she was chosen, how she prepared, what happened in that dark inner chamber where she fell into trance and spoke in the god's voice. The oracle was not a supernatural being, she was a woman, a human being selected from among the local population to serve the god. But in her role as Pythia, she became something more than human, a conduit, a vessel through which divine knowledge flowed into the mortal world. The selection of the Pythia changed over the centuries. In the earliest periods, the priestess was always a young virgin, chosen for her purity and innocence. The role was prestigious but dangerous. These young women bore enormous responsibility. The prophecies they spoke could determine whether cities went to war, whether colonies were founded, whether political alliances held or collapsed. Over time, after incidents that are only vaguely hinted at in ancient sources, possibly involving the seduction or violation of a young Pythia, the requirements changed. The sanctuary began choosing older women past the age of childbearing, often widows from respectable local families. These women would be at least 50 years old when they took on the role. They dressed in the clothing of maidens, white robes and simple adornments, symbolically returning to a state of purity regardless of their actual life experience. This was a practical change that protected the women themselves while maintaining the oracle's authority. The Pythia served for life once chosen. It was not a role you could resign from or take up part-time. You became the Pythia, and that identity superseded your previous existence. Your family life, your personal relationships, your individual hopes and fears. All of these took second place to your function as the god's mouthpiece. You lived in housing provided by the sanctuary. You were supported by offerings and temple funds. You were attended by priests who managed the practical aspects of the oracle's operation. But you were also isolated in certain ways, set apart from normal society. You could not marry once you became Pythia. You observed strict periods of purification and abstinence. Your body was no longer entirely your own. It belonged to Apollo, a living temple in which the god chose to dwell. On the days when the oracle was to speak, and these were limited only 1 day per month for most of the year, and not at all during the winter months, the Pythia underwent extensive purification rituals. She would rise before dawn and make her way to the Castalian Spring. There, in the cold mountain water flowing between the towering cliffs, she would bathe. The water was always freezing, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. It would shock the body awake, strip away sleep and comfort, prepare the flesh for what was to come. She would stand under the flow, letting it pour over her head, her shoulders, washing away anything profane or ordinary. The priests and attendants would be there, supervising, ensuring the ritual was performed correctly. Cleanliness of the body was only the beginning. What mattered more was the spiritual preparation, the opening of the self to the god's presence. After bathing in the spring, the Pythia would return to the sanctuary. She would fast, consuming only sacred water, and perhaps chewing laurel leaves. Laurel was Apollo's sacred plant, associated with prophecy and poetry. Some ancient sources suggest that chewing these leaves, or breathing smoke from burning laurel, helped induce the trance state necessary for prophecy. Modern analysis of laurel shows it contains compounds that can affect consciousness, though whether these alone could produce the oracle's visions is debatable. Regardless, the ritual consumption of laurel was part of the preparation, a physical act with symbolic weight. The Pythia was taking Apollo's sacred plant into her body, quite literally incorporating the god's presence. When the time came, she would descend into the temple's inner sanctum, a space called the Adyton. This was the Holy of Holies, the most sacred and restricted area of Apollo's temple. Only the Pythia and her attendant priests were allowed to enter. No suppliants, no matter how powerful or wealthy, could follow her there. The Adyton was below the main floor of the temple, accessed by stairs, a descent into darkness and secrecy. Ancient descriptions of this space are frustratingly vague, as the priests guarded its mysteries carefully. But we know there was a chasm or cleft in the rock, a natural fissure from which vapors emerged. The Pythia would position herself over this opening, sitting on a tripod, a 3-legged bronze seat that held her suspended above the earth. Below her, the vapors rose. She would breathe them in, these exhalations from deep within the mountain, and they would alter her consciousness, lifting her out of normal awareness and into a state where the god could speak through her. For centuries, this description of vapors rising from a chasm was considered mythological, something the ancients believed, but which had no basis in physical reality. Modern archaeological work in the 20th century found no evidence of any fissure beneath the temple. Scholars began to doubt whether the vapors had ever existed. Perhaps the trance was purely psychological, induced by fasting and ritual and belief. But more recent geological surveys have revealed something interesting. The temple site sits directly above intersecting fault lines. These faults, active and prone to seismic movement, create cracks in the limestone bedrock, and limestone, when fractured in certain ways, can release gases, including ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas that in small doses produces feelings of euphoria and dissociation. Ethylene was used as an anesthetic in the early 20th century before safer alternatives were developed. Its effects match ancient descriptions of the Pythia's trance, the dreamy detachment, the sense of floating, the loosening of normal consciousness. So the Pythia would sit on her tripod, breathing these vapors rising from the earth's depths. The priests would be nearby, ready to support her if she fell, ready to interpret whatever she said. And then the god would come. Apollo would enter her, filling the empty vessel of her prepared and purified body, speaking through her mouth in words that were his, not hers. The experience is described in ancient sources as overwhelming, almost violent. The god's possession of the priestess was not gentle. She would tremble, her body shaking, her eyes rolling back. Her voice, when it came, was not her normal voice. It was rougher, deeper, sometimes unintelligible. The words poured out of her in a rush, fragments and phrases, often in verse, riddling and strange. She was the instrument, and the god played her, and the music that emerged was prophecy. But the prophecies as delivered by the Pythia in her trance were rarely clear or straightforward. They came out as cryptic utterances, poetic fragments, ambiguous statements that could be interpreted multiple ways. This is where the priests became essential. They were the mediators between the god's raw prophecy and the suppliant's need for practical guidance. The priests would listen to the Pythia's trance speech. They would write down her words or commit them to memory, and then they would retire to compose the official oracle, the response that would be given to the person who had come seeking Apollo's wisdom. Sometimes the priests would shape the Pythia's utterances into formal hexameter verse, the meter used for epic poetry. Sometimes they would clarify ambiguous points, or add interpretive elements, or structure the response in ways that made it more useful. This priestly interpretation was not seen as corrupting the oracle. It was understood as a necessary part of the process. The god spoke in divine language, mysterious and multi-layered. Mortals needed that speech translated into something they could use to make decisions. The priests were the translators, the ones who understood both the language of the god and the needs of the suppliants. They were highly educated men, versed in poetry and philosophy, experienced in diplomacy and politics. They knew the histories of the Greek city-states, understood the political situations their visitors faced. This knowledge informed their interpretations. They could shape prophecies in ways that gave useful guidance while still maintaining the essential ambiguity that protected the oracle's reputation. And that ambiguity was crucial. The most famous prophecies from Delphi are the ones that could be read multiple ways, that seemed to promise one thing but delivered another. When the fabulously wealthy King Croesus of Lydia came to Delphi and asked whether he should attack Persia, the oracle told him that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, confident in his power and the oracle's support, attacked. He was crushed. The great empire he destroyed was his own. The prophecy had been accurate, just not in the way he assumed. This kind of double meaning was not a failure of the oracle. It was the point. The gods see further than mortals. Their wisdom encompasses possibilities we cannot imagine. The prophecy gives you truth, but truth is complex, and how you understand it reveals as much about you as about the future. The Pythia herself, after delivering prophecy, would remember little or nothing of what she had said. The trance state, induced by vapors and ritual and the intensity of belief, left her memory clouded. She would emerge from the adaton exhausted, sometimes needing days to recover from a single session. Being the channel for divine speech took a physical toll. Her body had been used by something greater than herself, and the experience left her depleted. The priests would care for her, seeing to her needs, protecting her from the crowds of suppliants who might try to approach her with questions or demands. She was too sacred to be treated as a normal person, too valuable to risk. The entire operation of the oracle depended on her willingness to undergo this ordeal month after month, year after year, until death or infirmity finally released her from service. Multiple Pythias served over the centuries, though their individual names are mostly lost to history. Ancient sources mention that at the height of Delphi's influence, there were sometimes 2 or even 3 Pythias serving simultaneously, taking turns to handle the volume of consultations. Each was a woman from the local community, unremarkable before her selection, transformed by her role into one of the most important religious figures in the ancient world. Her prophecies guided kings and commoners alike. Her words, channeled through her by Apollo, shaped the course of Greek history in ways both obvious and subtle. And yet she herself remained anonymous, a vessel whose identity mattered less than her function. The oracle was not about the individual woman. It was about the God who spoke through her, the sacred space where earth met divine will, the intersection of mortal questions and immortal wisdom. To understand Delphi, you must understand this strange arrangement, this system where a woman in trance, breathing geological vapors, speaking incoherent fragments, became the most trusted source of guidance in the entire Greek world. The system worked not despite its strangeness, but because of it. The trance proved the god's presence. The ambiguity of the prophecies proved their divine origin. The priestly interpretation made the oracle practical and useful, and the Pythia herself, anonymous and sacred, embodied the mystery at the heart of the whole operation, the unsettling truth that the gods speak to mortals in ways we can barely comprehend, through methods that transcend normal consciousness, in words that carry meanings we only partially grasp. The oracle was not rational, it was not meant to be. It was a window into a different kind of knowing, and that is why, for 1,000 years, people believed in it utterly. Now imagine yourself as a pilgrim approaching the sanctuary for the first time. You have traveled for days or weeks to reach this place. The roads were rough, winding through mountain passes, skirting precipices. You have slept in the open, or in small roadside inns. Your feet are blistered. Your clothes are dusty. But now you have arrived. You have bathed in the Castalian Spring, shocked by the cold water, but feeling somehow lighter, cleaner, prepared. And now you stand at the entrance to the sacred precinct itself, ready to begin your ascent of the sacred way. This path, this processional route that winds upward through the heart of the sanctuary, is where we will walk together now. Every step reveals something new, some monument or treasure house, some dedication that speaks to the wealth and power of those who came here before you. The entrance to the sanctuary is marked. There are boundary stones, inscribed markers that designate the temenos, the sacred space belonging to Apollo. Crossing this threshold means entering a different realm. The rules here are stricter. Behavior that might be acceptable in the profane world outside becomes sacrilege within the god's precinct. You must be respectful, quiet, conscious of the divine presence. The path ahead of you is not straight. It curves and switches back on itself, rising gradually toward the temple that waits above. This winding route is deliberate. It forces you to slow down, to process what you are seeing, to build anticipation. The ascent is part of the ritual, part of the transformation from ordinary traveler to sacred suppliant. On either side of the sacred way, monuments crowd close. These are treasuries, small temple-like buildings erected by different Greek city-states to house their offerings to Apollo. Each treasury is a statement of civic pride and piety. The city-states competed with each other to build the most impressive structures, to dedicate the richest offerings, to claim the most prominent positions along the sacred way. The treasury of the Siphnians was famous in its day, decorated with magnificent marble friezes depicting gods and giants in battle, Amazons fighting Greek heroes. The workmanship was exquisite, the detail astounding. The treasury of the Athenians, built after their victory over the Persians at Marathon, still stands in partial reconstruction today. It is a small but perfect Doric building, its proportions elegant, its marble glowing warm in the sunlight. Inside, the Athenians stored spoils of war, captured Persian weapons and armor, trophies that demonstrated their military prowess and their gratitude to the god who had blessed their victory. Between the treasuries, statues rise, not just a few but hundreds, thousands over the course of the sanctuary's active life. Every available space along the sacred way was eventually filled with bronze or marble figures. There were statues of gods, of heroes, of victorious athletes and generals. There were monuments commemorating military victories, depicting battles frozen in bronze. There were dedications from individuals seeking the gods' favor or giving thanks for prayers answered. Walking up the sacred way in the height of the sanctuary's power must have felt like walking through a forest of frozen figures, every statue a story, every dedication a prayer made visible. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. This was not empty mountain wilderness. This was a space utterly transformed by human devotion, packed so densely with sacred art that there was barely room to walk. The inscriptions on these monuments speak across the centuries. Many bases that once held statues remain, even when the statues themselves are long gone. The inscriptions tell you who dedicated what and why. A city thanks Apollo for guiding them to found a successful colony. A general dedicates a portion of his war spoils after a victory. An athlete commemorates a win at the Pythian Games. Reading these inscriptions, even in translation, you get a sense of the constant flow of human ambition and gratitude that poured into this place. Everyone wanted to be remembered here, to leave a mark, to have their name associated with this sacred center. The dedications were competitive, yes, but they were also genuine expressions of faith. People believed that Apollo had helped them, guided them, blessed them, and they wanted to give something back, to honor the god who had shown them favor. As you climb higher, the path brings you past the Athenian Stoa, a long covered colonnade where people could gather, sheltered from sun or rain. The Stoa served as a waiting area, a place for pilgrims to rest before their consultation with the oracle. It also functioned as a kind of museum, displaying trophies and dedications. The Athenians were particularly prolific in their offerings to Delphi, strengthening the ties between their city and the sanctuary. Every major Athenian victory resulted in new dedications here. The Stoa itself was a declaration of Athenian power and piety, a permanent presence on the sacred way that reminded all visitors of Athens' special relationship with Apollo. Further up, you pass the point where the serpent column once stood. This was a massive bronze monument created from the melted-down shields of Persian soldiers defeated at the Battle of Plataea. The column was formed of 3 intertwined bronze serpents rising more than 20 feet high, supporting a golden tripod at the top. It was one of the most impressive dedications in the entire sanctuary, a powerful statement about Greek unity against the Persian threat. The column eventually was taken to Constantinople and still stands there today, though the golden tripod is long gone. But in its original location at Delphi, it was a focal point impossible to miss, a reminder that the Greek city-states, despite their constant rivalries, could unite when faced with a common enemy. The sacred way continues its upward curve, and now the Temple of Apollo itself comes into view. This is the heart of the sanctuary, the reason all these treasuries and monuments exist. The temple sits on a terrace carved into the mountainside, dominating the sacred precinct. It is not the original temple. The building you see today, even in ruins, is the 4th or possibly 5th temple to occupy this spot. Earlier temples were destroyed by fire, earthquake, or combinations of both. Each time, the Greeks rebuilt, making the new temple larger and more magnificent than its predecessor. The temple that still stands in partial form dates to the 4th century BCE, built after an earthquake destroyed its predecessor in the 370s. Greek city-states from across the Mediterranean contributed to the rebuilding, demonstrating how important this sanctuary was to the entire Hellenic world. The temple is Doric in style, the oldest and most severe of the Greek architectural orders. 6 columns across the front, 15 along each side, built of local limestone that was covered in stucco to give it a smooth, uniform appearance. The columns are massive, tapering slightly as they rise, their fluting catching the light. The temple sits on a broad platform, raised above the surrounding space, emphasizing its importance. To reach the entrance, you would climb a ramp or stairs, physically elevating yourself toward the divine. The whole structure is designed to inspire awe, to make you feel small in the presence of something greater. The proportions are careful, mathematically precise. The ancient Greeks believed that beauty reflected divine order, that perfect ratios and harmonious measurements brought the human realm closer to the celestial. On the temple's pediments, the triangular spaces above the front and rear colonnades, there were once elaborate sculptural groups. The front pediment showed Apollo arriving at Delphi, his first coming to claim the sanctuary. The back showed Dionysus, Apollo's divine counterpart who ruled Delphi during the winter months when Apollo was said to travel to the land of the Hyperboreans. These gods shared the sanctuary, each taking their season. Apollo's time was spring, summer, and early autumn, the months when the oracle spoke and pilgrims came. Dionysus claimed winter, when the mountain was snowbound and the oracle silent, when the worship turned from rational prophecy to ecstatic winter mysteries. The temple's sculpture acknowledged this dual nature, this balance between order and ecstasy, light and darkness, the clarity of Apollonian wisdom and the wild divine possession of Dionysian ritual. Inside the temple, beyond the outer colonnade, was a front chamber called the pronaos. Here, carved into the stone, were the famous maxims that have defined Greek philosophy and ethics for millennia. Know thyself was inscribed here, bemothe seton in ancient Greek, a command to self-examination and humility. Nothing in excess was another midin agan, a reminder of the Greek ideal of moderation in all things. These were not just religious sayings, they were principles for living, ethical guidelines attributed to the 7 sages, the wisest men of early Greece. Seeing them inscribed on Apollo's temple gave them divine authority. They became central to how the Greeks understood proper human behavior, the values that should guide a life well lived. Beyond the pronaos was the main chamber of the temple, the naos or cella. This was a large hall where votive offerings were displayed, where suppliants gathered before their consultation with the oracle. The walls were lined with treasures, gifts from grateful kings and cities. There were golden bowls and silver tripods, elaborate bronze armor, precious textiles. The concentration of wealth in this single building was staggering. Each item represented a thank offering, a payment for prophecy received, a gift meant to honor the god and ensure his continued favor. The temple was both a religious site and a treasury, a bank of sacred wealth that marked Delphi's importance. And at the very back of the naos, accessed by steps leading down, was the Aditon, the forbidden inner sanctum, where the Pythia sat on her tripod over the sacred chasm. You, as a suppliant, would never enter that space. You would remain in the outer chambers while priests carried your questions inward, while the Pythia breathed the vapors and fell into trance, while Apollo spoke through her. The physical separation was absolute. The mystery remained inviolate. You might spend your entire life wondering what that inner chamber looked like, what the Pythia experienced, what it felt like to be in the presence of the god. But you would never know. Some mysteries were meant to remain hidden, their power residing precisely in their inaccessibility. Leaving the temple and continuing upward, the sacred way eventually brings you to the theater. This is carved directly into the mountainside, taking advantage of the natural slope to create rising tiers of stone seating. The theater could hold several thousand spectators, all focused on the circular orchestra below where performances took place. The acoustics here are remarkable. Even today, standing in the highest seats, you can hear someone speaking in a normal voice down in the orchestra. The ancient Greeks understood sound, understood how to shape stone to carry voices, to create spaces where thousands could share in a single performance. The theater was not just for entertainment, it was a sacred space, used during religious festivals for competitions in music and drama. The Pythian games included artistic contests as well as athletic ones, and the theater was where poets competed, where choruses sang hymns to Apollo, where plays were performed in the god's honor. Music was central to Apollo's worship. He was the god of the lyre, patron of poets and musicians. The theater at Delphi was his concert hall, a place where human artistry was offered up as worship, where the boundaries between art and religion dissolved. From the theater, if you continue climbing, you reach the very top of the sanctuary complex. Here, at the highest point accessible within the sacred precinct, is the stadium. This is a long, narrow track for foot races, surrounded by earthen banks where spectators sat. The stadium is simpler than the theater, less architecturally elaborate, but its position is significant. To compete here, you had to climb the entire sacred way, pass all the treasuries and monuments, pass the temple itself, pass the theater, and keep going until you reach this high exposed space where mountain winds blow and the air is thin. Running a race here was not just athletic competition. It was an offering of physical excellence to the god, performed in a space that brought you as close to the sky as the sanctuary allowed. The Pythian Games, held here every 4 years, were second only to the Olympics in prestige. Athletes came from all over the Greek world to compete, but unlike the Olympics, which focused purely on athletics, The Pythian games included musical and poetic competitions from the very beginning. This reflected Apollo's dual nature as god of both physical and artistic excellence, of the body and the mind. Winners at Delphi received crowns of laurel, Apollo's sacred plant, a prize that carried no monetary value but enormous prestige. To be a Pythian victor was to achieve glory that would last for generations. Your name would be recorded. Your city would honor you. You had competed under the god's gaze and proven yourself worthy. Walking the sacred way today, even in ruins, you can still feel the power of this designed experience. The path forces you to encounter the accumulated devotion of centuries. Every monument you pass represents someone's faith, someone's gratitude, someone's ambition to be remembered in this sacred space. The climb is gradual but relentless, pulling you upward through layers of meaning and history, building toward the encounter with the temple itself. And beyond the temple, the climb continues, through theater and stadium to the very edge of what human ambition could achieve on this mountainside. The sacred way is more than a path. It is a pilgrimage in compressed form, a journey from the profane world at the entrance to the heights where mortals approached as close to the divine as flesh could bear. Every pilgrim who walked this way was transformed by the journey, prepared by what they saw for the moment when they would stand before the oracle and hear the god speak. Every 4 years, the sanctuary transformed. The quiet rhythm of monthly consultations with the oracle gave way to something much larger and more public. The Pythian Games arrived, bringing athletes and artists from across the Greek world, turning Delphi into a gathering place where competition and worship blended into a single great festival. These games were older than the Olympics themselves, though they took their final form later. Originally, they consisted only of musical competitions, contests in singing and lyre playing, honoring Apollo as god of music and poetry. But over time, athletic events were added, races and combat sports, making the Pythian Games a comprehensive celebration of human excellence in all its forms. To understand Delphi's place in Greek culture, you must understand these games, the prestige they carried, the way they drew people together and reinforced the sanctuary's central importance. The games were held in late summer, when the roads were passable and the weather most cooperative. In the months leading up to the festival, athletes would train in their home cities, preparing their bodies for the tests to come. Musicians would rehearse, perfecting their technique on the lyre or aelos, memorizing the long hymns they would perform. Poets would craft verses, hoping to win the competition for newly composed works. And as the appointed time approached, all of them would begin the journey to Delphi, traveling by foot or on horseback, by ship across the Gulf of Corinth, and then up into the mountains. The roads would fill with travelers all heading in the same direction, creating a moving stream of humanity converging on the sacred site. Arriving at Delphi during the games must have been overwhelming. The sanctuary, normally relatively quiet between oracle days, would be packed with thousands of visitors. Temporary shelters and tents would spring up around the sacred precinct to house the influx. Merchants would set up stalls selling food, wine, and souvenirs. The air would be filled with the sounds of many dialects of Greek, with the smell of cooking food, with the constant movement and energy of a major festival. This was a time when the usual solemnity of the oracle site gave way to something more festive, more communal. People came not just to compete or watch competitions, but to see and be seen, to make political connections, to conduct business, to participate in the shared culture of the Greek world. The games opened with sacrifices and processions. Animals, often hundreds of them, would be led to Apollo's temple and slaughtered on the great altar that stood before it. The smoke from burning offerings would rise into the mountain air, carrying prayers upward to the god. Priests would perform the traditional rites, invoking Apollo's blessing on the games, asking him to witness the contests and favor the worthy. The formal opening ceremonies would include the singing of the ancient Pythian hymn, a long musical composition that told the story of Apollo's victory over Pythia. This hymn was central to the games, performed by professional musicians whose skill had been honed over years of practice. The performance was not just entertainment. It was a sacred act, a retelling of the founding myth that gave meaning to everything that followed. The athletic competitions took place over several days. In the stadium at the top of the sanctuary, runners would line up for the sprint, the single stayed race that covered the length of the track, roughly 200 meters. The start was signaled, and they would explode forward, running on packed earth with bare feet, their bodies trained to peak condition. The crowd would roar from the banks on either side, thousands of voices cheering for their favorite, for their city's representative. The winner would cross the finish line and immediately be showered with acclaim, his name shouted, his victory celebrated. But the prize itself was simple, a wreath of laurel leaves cut from the sacred groves in the valley below. This crown carried no monetary value, but its symbolic weight was enormous. To wear the laurel of Pythian victory was to be marked as someone Apollo had favored, someone who had achieved excellence under the god's gaze. Other races followed. The double stayed, there and back, the long-distance race, multiple laps of the stadium, testing endurance as much as speed. There were combat sports as well, wrestling and boxing, and the pancration, that brutal combination of both where almost anything was permitted except biting and eye gouging. These contests were violent and dangerous. Injuries were common. Deaths, while rare, did happen. But the athletes accepted the risk as part of the honor. To compete at Delphi was to test yourself against the best, to push your body to its limits in service of excellence. Oret in Greek, the virtue of being the best you could possibly be. The musical competitions were equally prestigious, though less physically dangerous. These took place in the theater, where acoustics allowed every note to carry to the highest seats. Competitors would play the lyre, a stringed instrument sacred to Apollo, performing either traditional pieces or their own compositions. The judges, chosen for their expertise and impartiality, would listen carefully, assessing technical skill, creativity, the emotional impact of the performance. A masterful lyre player could move an audience to tears, could create moments of transcendent beauty that felt like the god himself was present in the music. The competition for solo alols, a reed instrument similar to an oboe, was equally intense. The alols had a different character than the lyre, more wild and ecstatic, more associated with Dionysus than Apollo, but it had its place in the Pythian games nonetheless. There were also competitions in singing, both solo and choral. Poets would perform their own verses, epic or lyric, demonstrating mastery of language and meter. The best poems composed for the games would be remembered and repeated, adding to the treasury of Greek literature. Some of these works survive to this day, preserved because they were considered worth copying and recopying through the centuries. Winning the poetry competition at Delphi could launch a career. It brought recognition, commissions from wealthy patrons, invitations to perform at other festivals. The games were not just about crowning winners, they were about identifying and celebrating excellence, about giving the best artists and athletes a platform where their achievements could be seen by the entire Greek world. Between the formal competitions, there were social aspects to the games that mattered just as much as the contests themselves. The gathering at Delphi was one of the few times when Greeks from different city-states, often rivals or even enemies, would come together in a context of peace. The sanctuary and its environs were considered sacred ground where warfare was prohibited. This created a temporary space for diplomacy, for making alliances, for negotiating treaties. Politicians and generals would attend the games not just to watch competitions but to conduct the business of statecraft. Marriages between elite families from different cities might be arranged here. Trade agreements could be negotiated. The games provided neutral ground where enemies could meet and talk without weapons, where the bonds of shared Greek culture could overcome the divisions of politics. The festival was also a time for display and propaganda. City-states would send embassies, official delegations that represented their city's power and wealth. These embassies would arrive with elaborate ceremonies, bringing gifts for Apollo, dedicating new monuments on the sacred way. A city that had recently won a major military victory might dedicate captured armor or weapons, making sure everyone at the games knew of their triumph. Artists would be commissioned to create statues commemorating the victory, which would then be placed prominently where all visitors would see them. The games became a venue for competitive display, where cities tried to outdo each other in demonstrations of piety, wealth, and achievement. For ordinary Greeks, the games were a rare opportunity to experience something beyond their own small city or village. Most people in the ancient world traveled rarely, if at all. Their lives were bounded by the fields they farmed, or the workshops where they labored. But the Pythian games drew people from their homes, gave them a reason to make the long journey to Delphi. Once there, they would encounter Greeks from other regions, hear different dialects, see different styles of dress and armor. They would witness athletic performances that pushed human capability to its limits. They would hear music that represented the highest achievements of Greek culture. and they would participate, even as spectators, in a shared religious experience that reinforced their identity as Hellenes, as members of a civilization bound together by language, religion, and cultural values despite political fragmentation. The games lasted several days, and at their conclusion there would be final ceremonies, final sacrifices, and a proclamation of all the winners. Each victor would be called forward, crowned with laurel, their name and city announced to the assembled crowd. This was the moment of ultimate glory, the recognition that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In their home cities, they would be welcomed as heroes. Poets would compose odes in their honor. They might be granted privileges, exemptions from taxes or military service. Some cities even knocked holes in their walls to welcome a Pythian victor home. The symbolism being that a city with such a man among its citizens had no need of walls for defense. The victory was not just personal achievement, it reflected glory on the entire community that had produced such excellence. After the games, the crowds would disperse. Athletes and spectators would begin the long journey home, carrying with them memories of what they had witnessed, stories they would tell for years. The merchants would pack up their stalls. The temporary shelters would be dismantled. The sanctuary would return to its normal quiet rhythm, the oracle resuming her monthly consultations, the priest tending the sacred spaces. But the impact of the games lingered. The new monuments dedicated during the festival would stand for centuries, reminding future visitors of past glories. The names of winners would be recorded, becoming part of Delphi's accumulated history. And 4 years later, the cycle would repeat. The roads would fill again with travelers, and the sacred precinct would once more transform into the bustling center of Greek culture and competition. The Pythian Games were more than entertainment or sport. They were a ritual affirmation of Greek identity and values. They celebrated the ideal of arete, the pursuit of excellence in all things. They honored Apollo, god of music and prophecy, light and order, demonstrating that worship could include the perfection of athletic and artistic skills, as much as prayer and sacrifice. They brought together a politically fragmented people and reminded them of what they shared, creating bonds of culture and religion that persisted even when their cities were at war. And they made Delphi not just a place to consult an oracle, but a living center of Greek civilization, a place where the best of what Greek culture could achieve was put on display for all to see and celebrate. Now imagine yourself not as a spectator at the games, but as a pilgrim who has come with a question. You have traveled far, perhaps from Athens or Sparta, perhaps from one of the colonial cities on the coast of Asia Minor or Sicily. The journey has taken weeks. You have spent money you could barely afford on offerings, on the fees required to consult the oracle, on food and shelter along the way. You carry with you a question that weighs heavily on your heart. A decision you cannot make alone, a future you cannot see clearly. Should you accept a marriage proposal? Should you undertake a dangerous business venture? Should your city found a colony in distant lands? These are the kinds of questions that brought people to Delphi, matters where human wisdom felt insufficient, where divine guidance seemed necessary. You arrive at the sanctuary and immediately begin the process of purification. The Castalian Spring awaits you, its cold water shocking against your skin. You strip and stand beneath the flow, feeling the mountain cold seep into your bones. This is not comfortable, but comfort is not the point. You are washing away the ordinary world, preparing yourself to approach the sacred. After bathing, you dress in clean clothes you have brought for this purpose. You make your way to the sanctuary entrance, joining others who have come with their own questions, their own needs. The waiting period might be long. The oracle speaks only on certain days, and many people seek her guidance. You might wait for days or even weeks before your turn comes. During this waiting period, you stay in the town of Delphi, the settlement that grew up around the sanctuary to serve the constant stream of pilgrims. This town is unlike others in Greece. Its entire economy revolves around the oracle. There are inns where travelers lodge, paying for simple rooms and meals. There are shops selling votives and offerings, small statues or plaques that you can dedicate at the temple. There are priests and guides who for a fee will help you navigate the rituals, advise you on proper conduct, ensure you do not accidentally commit some breach of protocol that might invalidate your consultation. The town is cosmopolitan in a way most Greek settlements are not. You hear many dialects here, see dress from different regions, encounter travelers from places you have only heard about in stories. Some of these pilgrims are wealthy. accompanied by servants, able to pay the highest fees that guarantee quicker access to the oracle. Others are poor, like you perhaps, carrying only what they could scrape together, hoping the god will hear them despite their modest offering. The sanctuary's priests are pragmatic about this. They accept offerings of different scales. A wealthy king might dedicate a golden tripod or a bronze statue. A poor farmer might offer a single dove or a small cake of grain. Apollo, through his priests, accepts both. The oracle is not only for the powerful, though the powerful certainly receive priority. There is a schedule, a system, and your place in it depends partly on what you can pay, partly on what your city's relationship with Delphi is like, and partly on luck and timing. While you wait, you spend your days in the sanctuary, walking the sacred way, looking at the monuments. You see dedications from cities you have heard of, victories commemorated, oracles thanked. You begin to understand the scope of Delphi's influence, the way every corner of the Greek world has ties to this place. You might speak with other pilgrims, sharing stories, comparing questions. There is a community among those waiting, a shared nervous anticipation. Everyone here is seeking something they cannot find elsewhere. Everyone has reached a point where normal human wisdom is not enough. Finally, your day comes. The priests inform you that the oracle will see you. You must prepare. You have already been ritually purified days ago, but now there are additional steps. You must offer a preliminary sacrifice, a small animal whose signs will be read to determine if the god is willing to speak today. A goat is brought. Water is sprinkled on it. If the goat shivers, the omen is favorable. The oracle will speak. If it does not, the day is inauspicious, and consultations are postponed. This is not mere superstition. The trembling of the goat is understood as the god's response to the question of whether he will grant prophecy today. The priests take this seriously. If the signs are bad, the oracle does not sit on her tripod, and you must wait and try again. But today the goat shivers. The priests nod. The sacrifice proceeds. The animal is killed, its blood offered to Apollo. Parts of the meat are burned on the altar, the smoke rising to the god. Other parts are set aside for the priests and sanctuary staff. This is how they are fed. From the constant stream of sacrifices, you have paid your fees, offered your sacrifice, completed the rituals. Now you are led toward the temple. Your heart pounds. This is the moment you have traveled so far to reach. You enter the temple, but not its inner sanctum. You remain in the outer chamber, the nares, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of centuries. A priest approaches and asks your question. You state it clearly, having rehearsed the words many times. Should you accept the marriage offer from the neighboring family? The priest nods, memorizes your words, and disappears toward the back of the temple, descending to the adyton, where the Pythia waits in darkness over the sacred chasm. You are left standing in the nares with other suppliants, waiting in tense silence. Time passes slowly. You do not know what is happening below. You imagine the Pythia breathing vapors, falling into trance, the god entering her. You picture the moment when Apollo speaks through her mouth, his divine will made manifest in human speech. The waiting is almost unbearable. This answer will shape your life. If the oracle says yes, you will marry into that family, your fate bound to theirs. If she says no, you will refuse, perhaps insulting powerful neighbors, creating enmity. You need the god's guidance. You need to know you are making the right choice. Finally, the priest returns. He carries a small scroll or tablet on which the oracle's response has been written. He reads it to you, and his voice is formal, distant. If you marry in the month of Apollo's return, your household will prosper. If you delay until winter, discord will follow. The words are clear enough in their structure, but ambiguous in their application. Apollo returns in spring. Does that mean you should marry immediately, or wait until next spring? What constitutes delay? When exactly does winter begin? The priest offers no further interpretation, unless you pay an additional fee, which you cannot afford. So you are left with the prophecy as given, words that feel both significant and frustratingly unclear. You leave the temple with this answer, turning it over in your mind. Other pilgrims emerge with their own oracles, similarly cryptic. One was told that a voyage would be blessed if undertaken with pure intention. Another heard that a legal dispute would be resolved when the new moon rises. Everyone is trying to understand what their oracle means, how to apply divine words to mortal situations. This is the nature of prophecy at Delphi. It gives you something to hold on to, divine sanction for a decision, but it does not remove the need for judgment. You must still interpret, still choose, still act. The oracle has spoken, but you must figure out what it means. For some, this ambiguity is frustrating. They came seeking clear yes or no answers and received instead poetic riddles. But for many, the ambiguity is part of the prophecy's power. If the oracle simply told you what to do, it would remove your agency, turn you into a puppet. Instead, it gives you a framework, a lens through which to view your situation. Now you can think about the marriage proposal in terms of timing, of seasons, of Apollo's cycles. The oracle has made you pay attention to things you might have overlooked, and when you finally make your decision, you will feel that the god has guided you, even if the exact path was yours to choose. The wealthy and powerful, when they consulted the oracle, received more attention and often more elaborate responses. Kings and city officials brought enormous offerings and paid fees that guaranteed private consultations. Their questions were often matters of state. Should we go to war? Should we form an alliance with that city? Where should we send our colonists? The answers they received could be lengthy, sometimes in verse, crafted carefully by the priests who understood the political implications. These consultations were diplomatic events as much as religious ones. The oracle's authority was so great that even kings felt bound by her words. A declaration from Delphi could legitimize a military campaign or prevent one. It could determine where Greek colonies were founded, spreading Hellenic culture across the Mediterranean. One of the most famous consultations involved Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia in Asia Minor. Before undertaking a war against Persia, he sent envoys to Delphi with lavish gifts, gold and silver beyond counting. He asked whether he should attack. The oracle responded that if he crossed the river Hellas and attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, confident in his wealth and military power, interpreted this as a promise of victory. He attacked. He was utterly defeated. The great empire he destroyed was his own. When he later sent envoys to complain that the oracle had misled him, the Pythia's priests replied that the prophecy had been accurate. Croesus had simply failed to understand it. He should have asked which empire would be destroyed. The oracle spoke truth, but truth is complex, and mortals who think they understand divine words without humility deserve what they get. This story, whether historical or legendary, captures something essential about how Delphi functioned. The oracle's prophecies were famous for their ambiguity, for meanings that could be read multiple ways. This was not a flaw. It was the point. The gods see more than mortals. Their wisdom encompasses possibilities we cannot imagine. A prophecy that seems to promise one thing might actually mean another. The wise person treats the oracle's words with care, interpreting them humbly, aware that divine knowledge works differently than human understanding. The foolish person assumes the gods will simply tell them what they want to hear and suffers accordingly. For common people, though, the oracle often provided comfort rather than frustration. You came with genuine uncertainty about your life. You received words that you could believe came from a god who cared about your question, even if the answer was not perfectly clear, even if you still had to make your own choice. You had the sense that you were not entirely alone in that choice. The divine had spoken to you. Apollo had acknowledged your question. This was worth the journey, worth the cost, worth the hardship. You would return home with the oracle's words, share them with family and friends, and make your decision feeling that you had done everything possible to choose wisely. The oracle did not remove responsibility, but it offered reassurance that you were not making your choices in complete darkness. There was light, even if dim, even if flickering, coming from a source beyond yourself. The town of Delphi, where you stayed during your wait, was shaped entirely by this constant flow of pilgrims. Generations of families had made their living serving those who came to consult the oracle. The guides who showed you the monuments, the priests who performed the sacrifices, the innkeepers who gave you shelter, the merchants who sold you offerings, all of them depended on the oracle's reputation. Their prosperity rose and fell with the number of visitors. In good years, when the sanctuary's fame was high and pilgrims numerous, the town thrived. In difficult periods, when war closed the roads or political upheaval made travel dangerous, the town struggled. But for nearly 1,000 years, the oracle spoke, and the pilgrims came, and the town endured. This was daily life at Delphi for those who lived there permanently. It was a life oriented entirely around the sacred, around facilitating the connection between mortals and the divine. The town existed because the oracle existed. Its entire purpose was to support the sanctuary, to make it possible for people from across the world to come and hear Apollo speak. In this way, Delphi was unique. Other Greek cities had economies based on farming or trade or manufacture. Delphi's economy was based on prophecy, on the belief that this particular place, this sanctuary on this mountainside, was where the boundary between mortal and divine grew thin enough for communication to pass through. That belief sustained thousands of lives across centuries, creating a community whose reason for being was entirely religious, entirely dependent on faith in the god who spoke through his priestess in the darkness beneath the temple. But Delphi was never just a religious site serving individual pilgrims with personal questions. From early in its history, the sanctuary wielded enormous political power, influencing the decisions of city-states and shaping the course of Greek history. The oracle's pronouncements on matters of war and peace, colonization and alliance, carried weight that transcended religious authority. When Apollo spoke through his priestess on questions of state, kings and assemblies listened. To understand Delphi's true importance in the ancient world, you must understand this political dimension, the way sacred prophecy and practical power intertwined to make the sanctuary one of the most influential institutions in the Mediterranean. The oracle's political influence began early, perhaps as early as the 8th century BCE, when Greek city-states started founding colonies around the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Overpopulation, political strife, or simple ambition drove these colonization efforts. A city would organize an expedition, gather volunteers, or assign citizens to go and send them out to establish a new settlement in distant lands. But where should they go? The Mediterranean was vast, largely unknown to the Greeks of that era. Sending people to found a colony was an enormous gamble. The colonists might find fertile land and prosper, or they might encounter hostile natives, disease, starvation. The mother city needed some assurance that the venture would succeed, some divine sanction for sending its citizens into the unknown. This is where Delphi became essential. Before founding a colony, the leaders of a Greek city would consult the oracle. They would ask Apollo where they should send their colonists, what lands would be favorable, what omens to look for. The oracle would respond, often with specific geographic details. Go to the island of Sicily, settle on the coast where you find a river mouth, look for the place where a fig tree grows from rock. These oracles, whether divinely inspired or based on the priest's accumulated geographic knowledge from questioning previous travelers, provided the colonists with destinations and markers. They sailed with Apollo's blessing, confident that the god had chosen their new home. When the colonies succeeded, which many did, the colonists remembered Delphi. They sent offerings back to the sanctuary, thanking Apollo for his guidance. They built treasuries on the sacred way, housing their dedications, maintaining ties to the oracle even across great distances. The relationship between Delphi and the colonial cities became a feedback loop. Successful colonies attributed their success to Apollo's prophecy, which enhanced the oracle's reputation, which made future colonization efforts more likely to seek Delphi's guidance. The sanctuary became the unofficial center for Greek expansion, the place where the decision to venture into unknown territories received divine authorization. This role gave Delphi enormous soft power. The priests knew where colonies had been founded, which areas had proven fertile, which coasts were friendly or hostile. They accumulated information from the constant flow of travelers passing through the sanctuary. When they crafted oracles about colonization, they could draw on this knowledge, giving advice that was genuinely useful while maintaining the framework of divine prophecy. The system worked because both sides benefited. The colonists received guidance and religious sanction. The oracle received credit for successful foundations and continued offerings from grateful cities. The political influence that came from this was enormous. Cities that maintained good relationships with Delphi could expect favorable oracles. Those that offended the sanctuary might receive discouraging prophecies or be told to wait for a more auspicious time. Beyond colonization, the oracle influenced military decisions. Before major campaigns, generals and city leaders would consult Apollo. Should we attack our neighbors? Should we form an alliance? What do the gods want us to do? The responses were often ambiguous enough to allow for interpretation, but they carried the weight of divine authority. A city that received an encouraging oracle would go to war confident that the gods favored their cause. A city warned against military action might reconsider, avoiding conflict that could have ended disastrously. The oracle served, whether intentionally or not, as a moderating force, a reason to pause and reflect before committing to violence. The sanctuary itself was governed by an organization called the Amphictyonic League, a coalition of Greek city-states who shared responsibility for Delphi's protection and administration. The league was religious in origin, dedicated to Apollo's worship, but it quickly took on political functions. Member states sent representatives to meet at Delphi twice a year, discussing matters related to the sanctuary's upkeep, settling disputes, and occasionally organizing military action against those who threatened the sacred site. The League gave smaller cities a voice in a political organization that could, in theory, stand up to larger powers. It created a network of states bound together by shared religious duty and mutual interest in Delphi's prosperity. This arrangement led to conflicts called sacred wars, fought ostensibly to protect the sanctuary, but often driven by political and economic motives. The first sacred war, fought in the early 6th century BCE, resulted in the city of Crisa being destroyed for allegedly mistreating pilgrims and imposing unfair tolls on the road to Delphi. The war established the principle that the sanctuary must be accessible, that no one should profit unduly from controlling access to the oracle. Later sacred wars involved complex alliances and power struggles between Greek city-states, with Delphi as the nominal cause but control of Greece as the real prize. The sanctuary's sacred status made it valuable, and those who could claim to be its protectors gained legitimacy and influence. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states in classical Greece, both cultivated special relationships with Delphi. Athens dedicated multiple treasuries on the sacred way, and sent elaborate embassies to the games. The city's victories over Persia in the early 5th century BCE were commemorated with monuments at Delphi, including the treasury of the Athenians, which still stands partially reconstructed today. Sparta, militaristic and pious, consulted the oracle frequently on matters of state, and followed its guidance with a seriousness that other cities sometimes lacked. Both cities understood that maintaining good relations with Delphi was politically valuable. The oracle's endorsement could sway public opinion, justify controversial decisions, or legitimize a city's claims to leadership in Greece. The relationship between political power and prophecy was complex and sometimes cynical. The priests of Delphi were not naive. They understood politics. They knew which cities were powerful, which alliances mattered, which suppliants could be offended, and which could not. When crafting oracles for political questions, they had to balance religious authority with practical diplomacy. An oracle that too obviously favored one side in a dispute might damage the sanctuary's reputation for impartiality. An oracle that offended a powerful city might result in reduced offerings or even military threat. The priests navigated these challenges with care, maintaining the oracle's mystique while operating in a very real political landscape. There were accusations, ancient and modern, that the oracle could be bribed, that wealthy suppliants could pay for favorable prophecies. The evidence is mixed. Certainly wealth granted access and priority in consultations. Certainly the priests were aware of who gave generously to the sanctuary, but outright bribery seems to have been rare, or at least well hidden. The oracle's power depended on its perceived integrity. If prophecies were obviously for sale, the system would have collapsed. People believed in the oracle because they trusted that Apollo spoke through his priestess, and that trust required at least the appearance of honesty. The priests had to maintain that appearance, even while operating in a world where politics and religion were inseparably intertwined. One famous example of the oracle's political role involves the Athenian statesman Themistocles. Before the Persian invasion of 480 BCE, Athens consulted Delphi about what to do in the face of the approaching massive Persian army. The first oracle they received was terrifying, advising them to flee, to abandon their city and save themselves. The Athenian envoys, devastated by this response, pleaded for a second consultation. The oracle spoke again, this time mentioning wooden walls, saying that wooden walls would save Athens when all else fell. This oracle was ambiguous. What were the wooden walls? Some Athenians thought it meant the ancient wooden palisade on the Acropolis. Themistocles argued it meant ships, Athens' navy. He convinced the city to evacuate the civilian population and commit fully to a naval strategy. The Athenian fleet fought at Salamis and won one of the most decisive naval battles in history, turning back the Persian invasion. Themistocles credited the oracle with Athens' salvation, and the oracle's reputation grew enormously from this success. But notice the ambiguity. If Athens had lost, the oracle could still have been interpreted as accurate. Wooden walls, after all, could mean many things. This flexibility was the oracle's genius. Prophecies were crafted to be true regardless of outcome, adaptable to whatever actually happened. This does not mean they were fraudulent. It means they operated on a different logic than modern prediction. They provided a framework for understanding events, a divine perspective that helped people make sense of success or failure. The oracle did not predict the future in a straightforward sense. It offered a sacred interpretation of possibility, words that could guide decisions without constraining them absolutely. The political power of Delphi gradually declined as the Greek world changed. When Philip II of Macedon rose to power in the mid-4th century BCE, beginning the process that would eventually unite Greece under Macedonian rule, the oracle's influence waned. Philip was pious, and he consulted Delphi, but he did not need the oracle's authority the way earlier Greek leaders had. His power came from his army, not from divine sanction. And when his son Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, creating a Hellenistic world that stretched from Greece to India, the political landscape became too large and complex for a single oracle to dominate. Delphi remained prestigious, but its role in shaping political decisions diminished. Yet for centuries during the height of the Greek classical age, Delphi was more than a religious site. It was a political institution, a neutral ground where enemies could meet, a source of authority that transcended any single city's power. The oracle's pronouncements carried weight because people believed in them, and they believed in them partly because the oracle was careful, ambiguous, and wise enough to survive in a world of constant political upheaval. The sanctuary's priests were diplomats as much as religious figures, navigating between faith and power, preserving the oracle's mystique while operating in the very practical realm of Greek politics. Understanding this duality is essential to understanding Delphi. It was a place where the sacred and the political met, where divine prophecy and human ambition intertwined, creating an institution that shaped history while claiming to stand outside it. But there was another dimension to Delphi that transcended politics and prophecy, something that made the sanctuary important even to those who never consulted the oracle or witnessed the games. Carved into the stone of Apollo's temple were words that would echo through Western philosophy and ethics for millennia. Know thyself, the inscription read, "Nothi Seiton" in ancient Greek. Below it, another maxim, "Nothing in excess, Medin agon." These were not prophecies. They were principles, ethical guidelines attributed to the 7 sages, the wisest men of early Greece. Their presence here, on the god's temple, gave them divine authority and made Delphi not just a place of prophecy but a place of wisdom. The maxim "Know thyself" is deceptively simple. On one level, it is a call to self-awareness, to understanding your own capabilities and limitations. Do not overreach. Do not claim to be more than you are. Recognize that you are mortal, not divine, and act accordingly. This was essential wisdom in a culture that told stories of hubris, of mortals who thought themselves equal to gods and suffered terrible fates as a result. The maxim reminded visitors to Delphi that they stood at the threshold of the divine, that they were about to hear a god speak, but that they themselves remained human, bounded by mortality and ignorance. The knowledge they sought must be tempered by knowledge of their own limitations. But the maxim had deeper implications as well. To know yourself meant to engage in constant self-examination, to question your motives and assumptions, to understand why you act as you do. This call to introspection became central to Greek philosophy, particularly in the work of Socrates. Socrates famously claimed that he knew nothing, that his only wisdom was awareness of his own ignorance. He spent his life questioning others, forcing them to examine their beliefs, to see if they truly knew what they claimed to know. When asked about the source of his philosophical mission, Socrates pointed to Delphi. The oracle had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. Puzzled by this, since he was aware of his own ignorance, Socrates set out to prove the oracle wrong by finding someone wiser. He questioned everyone he could, and he discovered that while he knew nothing, others did not even know that they knew nothing. The oracle had been right. Socrates' wisdom was his self-awareness, his knowledge of his own ignorance. This story, whether literally true or a philosophical parable, demonstrates how Delphi influenced Greek thought. The oracle's pronouncement about Socrates gave him his life's purpose. The temple's maxim, "Know thyself," became the foundation of his philosophical method. Socrates turned prophecy into philosophy, using the god's words as justification for a life of questioning and examination. He made self-knowledge not just a religious duty, but an ethical imperative. The unexamined life, he argued, was not worth living, and this principle, born at Delphi and developed in Athens, became one of the cornerstones of Western philosophy. The other great maxim, "Nothing in excess," spoke to the Greek ideal of moderation. The Greeks valued balance, the golden mean between extremes. Too much courage becomes recklessness, too much caution becomes cowardice, too much pride becomes hubris. The virtuous person finds the middle path, the measured response, the appropriate degree. This principle governed everything from personal behavior to political decisions to artistic creation. Greek temples were built with careful proportions, mathematically precise, embodying in stone the principle of harmonic balance. Greek tragedy explored what happened when characters went too far, when they exceeded the boundaries of proper human behavior. The maxim on Apollo's temple reminded everyone who entered that excess led to disaster, that the gods favored moderation, that wisdom lay in knowing when enough was enough. These maxims, along with others inscribed at Delphi, became known throughout the Greek world. They were quoted by philosophers, poets, and politicians. They shaped how Greeks thought about ethics and proper behavior. Delphi thus became a source of wisdom that extended far beyond the oracle's specific prophecies. The sanctuary offered not just answers to individual questions, but guiding principles for how to live. Pilgrims who came seeking prophecy might also pause before the temple, reading these words carved in stone, and take away something more lasting than any cryptic oracle. They took away principles that could guide them through life's uncertainties, maxims that did not tell them what to do in specific situations but gave them frameworks for making decisions themselves. The sanctuary attracted philosophers and thinkers who came not necessarily to consult the oracle, but to contemplate in a place associated with wisdom. The setting itself, the dramatic mountain landscape, the sense of standing at the world's center, encouraged deep thought. Philosophers would walk the sacred way, arguing and discussing, using the sanctuary as a backdrop for their inquiries into truth and knowledge. The Pythian games included intellectual competitions, contests in poetry and rhetoric that drew the best minds of Greece. Delphi became, in addition to its religious and political roles, an intellectual center, a place where ideas were exchanged and debated. This philosophical dimension of Delphi also manifested in the oracle's responses to certain questions. When people asked not about practical matters but about the nature of good and evil, about how to live justly, about the meaning of piety, the oracles they received sometimes took on a philosophical character. These responses, passed down through literature and philosophical texts, show the oracle engaging with abstract questions, offering wisdom that transcended immediate circumstances. The boundary between prophecy and philosophy was not rigid. Both claimed access to truth that went beyond surface appearances. Both required interpretation and deep thought. The oracle was in a sense a philosophical teacher who spoke in riddles, forcing the listener to think, to question, to arrive at understanding through effort, rather than having answers simply handed over. The influence of Delphi's maxims extended into Roman times and beyond. When the Romans conquered Greece, they adopted and adapted much of Greek culture, including philosophy. Roman thinkers like Cicero and Plutarch wrote about Delphi, discussing the maxims and their meanings, relating stories about the oracle, preserving for later generations the wisdom associated with the sanctuary. Plutarch actually served as a priest at Delphi late in his life, and he wrote several works exploring the oracle's philosophical dimensions, its decline, and what it had meant to Greek culture. Through these texts, Delphi's influence reached far beyond its physical location and active period, becoming part of the intellectual inheritance of Western civilization. The maxim "Know thyself" eventually transcended its Delphic origins to become a universal principle. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered it through classical texts and made it central to humanistic philosophy. Enlightenment thinkers used it as a foundation for inquiries into human nature and consciousness. Modern psychology, in some ways, is an elaboration of this ancient call to self-knowledge, an attempt to understand the hidden depths of the psyche through introspection and analysis. The words carved on a temple wall 2,500 years ago continue to resonate, continue to challenge people to understand themselves, to recognize their limitations, to live examined lives. Delphi's contribution to philosophy was not systematic. The sanctuary never produced a school of thought or a coherent philosophical system, but it provided something equally important. It provided a sacred space where wisdom was honored, where questions about how to live were treated as vital and worthy of divine attention. It gave authority to the pursuit of self-knowledge and moderation. It created a link between religious practice and philosophical inquiry that shaped how Greeks, and later Romans, and later still, all inheritors of classical culture, thought about wisdom and virtue. The oracle spoke prophecies that changed individual fates and political destinies, but the maxims on her temple walls changed how people thought about being human, about the examined life, about what it means to live well. Standing before those words today, even in ruins, even in a language most visitors cannot read, there is still power. On stones still bear the inscriptions, weathered but present, the message still speaks. Know yourself. Nothing in excess. These are not complex philosophical arguments. They are simple statements that contain depths of meaning, the kind of wisdom that seems obvious when you hear it but proves endlessly difficult to actually practice. The ancient Greeks struggled with these principles just as we do. They wrote tragedies about people who failed to know themselves, who exceeded proper bounds and suffered. They told stories of heroes brought low by their own flaws, of kings who mistook confidence for wisdom, and they came to Delphi, to the temple where these maxims were carved, seeking both prophecy and wisdom, hoping that the God who knew the future might also help them understand themselves and find the balanced path through life's complexities. As the centuries passed, the world that had created Delphi began to change. The oracle that had guided Greek colonization, influenced military campaigns, and spoken wisdom to philosophers, gradually faced challenges it could not answer with prophecy. The rise of rational philosophy and scientific thinking in the Hellenistic period created skepticism about divine communication. The Roman conquest of Greece brought a different religious sensibility, one that respected Greek gods but did not need their oracles with the same urgency. And finally, the rise of Christianity created a hostile force that viewed pagan oracles not as divine wisdom but as demonic deception. The decline of Delphi was slow, stretching across centuries, but it was inexorable. The sanctuary that had stood for 1,000 years would eventually fall silent, its temples abandoned, its prophecies ending. The first signs of decline appeared during the Hellenistic period, after Alexander the Great's conquests created a Greek-influenced empire stretching from Egypt to India. The world became larger, more complex, less centered on the small city-states of classical Greece. New philosophical schools emerged that emphasized reason over revelation, personal ethics over divine guidance. Stoics and Epicureans developed systems of thought that told people how to live without requiring consultation with oracles. Skeptics questioned whether prophecy was even possible, whether the gods communicated with mortals at all. These intellectual currents did not destroy Delphi overnight, but they eroded the cultural foundation that had made the oracle seem necessary. The Romans, when they conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, treated Delphi with respect. They were fascinated by Greek culture and eager to associate themselves with its prestige. Roman generals consulted the oracle. Roman emperors sent offerings to the sanctuary. The historian Livy records that the Romans, after capturing the Greek city of Tarentum, returned a golden bowl to Delphi that had been taken from the sanctuary generations earlier, demonstrating their piety and their desire to honor Greek religious traditions. But Roman consultation of the oracle was different from Greek practice. For the Romans, Delphi was a curiosity, a connection to the glorious Greek past, not a living necessity for political decisions. They had their own methods of divination, their own religious structures. They did not need Apollo's prophecy the way the Greeks had. Some Roman emperors did consult Delphi seriously. Nero visited the sanctuary and supposedly asked the oracle about his future. The response, if it was given, did not save him from eventual suicide. Hadrian, a Philhellene emperor who loved Greek culture, consulted the oracle multiple times and gave generously to the sanctuary's upkeep. But these imperial consultations were exceptions. Most Romans viewed Delphi as a tourist attraction, a place to visit and admire but not necessarily to trust for important decisions. The flow of pilgrims continued, but their motivations shifted. People came to see the famous sanctuary, to participate in the Pythian games which continued into the Roman period, to marvel at the accumulated treasures and monuments. They came less frequently with desperate questions requiring divine answers. The oracle continued to function, though with reduced frequency and prestige. The Pythia still sat on her tripod, still breathed the vapors, still spoke in trance. The priest still interpreted her words and delivered oracles to suppliants. But the responses became less politically significant, more focused on personal matters and ritual questions. The great oracles that had shaped Greek history, that had decided colonizations and wars, became rare. Instead, people asked about health, about marriage, about local religious observances. The oracle had not lost its religious character, but it had lost its political power. The world had moved beyond the point where a single sanctuary in Greece could claim to guide the decisions of empires. The decline accelerated in the late Roman period. In the 3rd century CE, the Emperor Diocletian consulted the oracle about the Christians, who were growing in numbers and influence throughout the empire. The oracle supposedly responded that the Christians prevented the gods from speaking clearly, that their presence polluted the sacred spaces and silenced divine voices. Whether this oracle was genuine or fabricated by later Christian writers as propaganda is unclear, but it captures the growing tension between pagan religion and Christianity. The Christians viewed places like Delphi as centers of false worship, demons masquerading as gods, leading people away from the true faith. As Christianity grew in power, pagan sanctuaries faced increasing hostility. In 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, beginning the process that would eventually make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christian emperors viewed pagan oracles with suspicion and hostility. They did not simply want to replace pagan worship with Christian practice. They wanted to actively suppress and destroy what they saw as demonic influence. Temples were closed, sacrifices were banned. The economic and legal structures that had supported places like Delphi for centuries were dismantled. The flow of pilgrims, already reduced, slowed to a trickle. Without offerings and consultation fees, the sanctuary could not maintain itself. The priests grew fewer. The rituals became sporadic. The final blow came in 393 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius issued a decree closing all pagan temples and banning pagan worship throughout the empire. Delphi fell under this ban. The oracle was silenced by imperial command. The Pythia, if one still served at that late date, would have descended to the Adyton for the last time, sat on the tripod, breathed the vapors, and spoken her final prophecy. We do not know what those last words were. If they were recorded, the record has not survived. The oracle that had spoken for 1,000 years simply stopped, not because the gods ceased to communicate, but because the human world had changed in ways that made prophecy irrelevant to the new order. After the closure, the sanctuary was abandoned. The priests departed. The buildings fell into disrepair. Without maintenance, without the constant activity of pilgrims and offerings, the physical structures began to decay. The roof of Apollo's temple collapsed, whether from earthquake or simple neglect. Earthquakes always a threat in this geologically active region. Damaged walls and toppled columns. The once magnificent monuments on the sacred way stood empty, their purpose forgotten by the new Christian population, who viewed them as relics of a pagan past to be ignored or destroyed. Some of the sanctuary's treasures were looted. Bronze statues were melted down for the value of the metal. Marble was taken for use in other building projects. The accumulated wealth of centuries, the offerings that had poured into Delphi from across the Greek world, was dispersed or destroyed. Christian writers of the period sometimes gloated over the fall of pagan sites, interpreting their destruction as proof that the old gods had been false all along, that Christ had triumphed over demons. The closure of Delphi was not mourned by the new Christian society. It was celebrated as a victory over deception, a cleansing of the land from false worship. Over the following centuries, the site was gradually buried. Earthquakes brought rock slides from the cliffs above. Soil washed down from the mountain, covering the terraces. The sacred way disappeared beneath earth and debris. Trees and brush grew over the ruins. A small village called Castri was established on the site. Its houses, built literally on top of the ancient sanctuary, its inhabitants unaware or unconcerned that they lived above one of the most important religious sites of the ancient world. For more than 1,000 years, Delphi existed only in texts, in the writings of ancient historians and philosophers, who described a sanctuary that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The memory of Delphi persisted in literature. Medieval and Renaissance scholars who read Greek and Latin texts encountered descriptions of the oracle. They read about the Pythia's prophecies, about the Pythian games, about the maxims carved on Apollo's temple. But these descriptions seemed almost mythical, stories from a distant past that might or might not have been real. Without physical evidence, without visible ruins, Delphi became more legend than history. Educated Europeans knew the name, knew the stories, but could not visit the place itself. It had vanished beneath a Greek village, its stones repurposed, its sacred spaces forgotten. This period of forgetting was perhaps necessary. The world that had created Delphi was gone, the religious framework that had made prophecy believable, that had brought pilgrims to this mountain sanctuary, had been replaced by Christianity with its different understanding of how the divine interacted with the mortal. The political structures that had given the oracle influence had dissolved. The Greek city-states that had competed to dedicate treasuries and monuments no longer existed. The oracle had served its time, had shaped history in profound ways, and then had faded when the conditions that sustained it changed. The ruins lay hidden, waiting beneath the village, holding their secrets for a time when they might be valued again, not as an active oracle but as a window into the past, a physical connection to the ancient world that had created Western civilization. The silence of the oracle was final. No prophecies would be spoken again from the adytum. No Pythia would sit on the tripod, breathing vapors. No pilgrims would climb the sacred way seeking divine guidance. The great sanctuary had fallen, brought down not by military conquest or divine judgment, but by the slow, inevitable change of human culture and belief. What remained were stories and stones buried beneath earth, and the memory of a place where mortals had believed they could hear the voice of a god. But stories and buried stones have a way of enduring. Centuries after the oracle fell silent, after the sanctuary was forgotten under the medieval village of Castri, the ancient world began to fascinate a new generation of European scholars and travelers. The Renaissance had revived interest in classical texts. By the 17th and 18th centuries, educated Europeans read Greek and Latin authors who described Delphi in detail. They knew about the oracle, the Pythian games, the treasuries lining the sacred way, and they began to wonder, could the site still exist? Could the ruins of this famous sanctuary still lie somewhere in the Greek mountains waiting to be rediscovered? Early travelers to Greece in the 18th century were often disappointed. The country was under Ottoman rule, difficult and sometimes dangerous for Europeans to visit. The landscape bore little obvious resemblance to the classical descriptions they had read. But some persistent seekers made their way to the region below Mount Parnassus. They encountered the village of Castri perched on terraces carved into the mountainside, and they began to notice something. There were ancient stones incorporated into the village walls. There were inscriptions barely visible, carved into rocks. There were local traditions about a sacred spring, about ancient buildings beneath the houses. Slowly the realization grew that Castri might be built directly on top of ancient Delphi. The Castalian Spring, still flowing between the towering cliffs, was identified correctly. Its location matched ancient descriptions too precisely to be coincidence. Travelers bathed in its cold waters just as ancient pilgrims had done, feeling the connection to the past. Some ancient building foundations were visible at the edges of the village, hinting at larger structures buried beneath. Inscriptions were copied, studied, published in scholarly journals. By the mid-19th century, it was widely accepted that Castri occupied the site of ancient Delphi. But excavating the ruins would require removing the entire modern village, an undertaking that seemed impossible both practically and ethically. The momentum for excavation built slowly. The French government, through its School of Archaeology in Athens, took particular interest in Delphi. French scholars had long been leaders in classical archaeology, and they recognized that excavating Delphi would be one of the 19th century's great archaeological achievements. The problem was the village. Hundreds of people lived in Castri, their homes built on foundations that might date back centuries. Simply destroying their homes to dig up ancient ruins was unconscionable, but the archaeological potential was too significant to ignore. The solution, when it finally came, was remarkably bold. The Greek government, with French support and funding, decided to relocate the entire village. In the early 1890s, negotiations began with Castri's residents. They were offered land and funds to build a new village nearby, on a site that did not cover ancient ruins. Some residents resisted, understandably reluctant to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations, but eventually, agreements were reached. A new village, which kept the name Delphi, was constructed about a kilometer away. The old village of Castri was systematically dismantled, its houses removed, its stones cleared away, revealing the ancient sanctuary beneath. The excavation began in earnest in 1892 under the direction of the French Archaeological School. What they found exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The sacred way emerged from the earth, its paving stones still in place. The treasuries appeared, their foundations intact, some with walls still standing several courses high. The theatre was uncovered, carved into the mountainside exactly where ancient sources said it should be. The stadium at the top of the sanctuary was excavated, its starting blocks for races still in position, and most spectacularly, the Temple of Apollo was revealed, its columns toppled by earthquakes but still present, waiting to be studied and partially reconstructed. As the excavation progressed, treasure after treasure came to light. Bronze and marble statues emerged from the earth, where they had fallen or been buried. Inscriptions on stone revealed dedications, records of victories, thank offerings to the god. The base of the serpent column was found, though the column itself had been taken to Constantinople centuries earlier. The treasury of the Athenians was identified and eventually reconstructed, giving modern visitors a sense of what these small but perfect buildings had looked like. And in the museum that was built to house the finds, sculptures of extraordinary quality were displayed, works that had been hidden underground for more than 1,000 years. One find in particular captured the world's imagination. In 1896, excavators uncovered fragments of a bronze statue. As more pieces were found and assembled, a figure emerged, a young man standing tall, one arm extended as though holding reins. This was the charioteer of Delphi, a bronze sculpture of breathtaking quality from the classical period. The figure is life-sized, his expression serene and focused, his robes falling in naturalistic folds. The level of detail is extraordinary. Individual braids of his hair are rendered. His eyes, inlaid with stone, seem to look into the distance. The sculpture was originally part of a larger group, a chariot with horses, dedicated to commemorate a victory in the Pythian Games. Most of the group was lost, but the charioteer survived, and he became the symbol of Delphi's rediscovery, proof that the ancient sanctuary had been real and magnificent. The excavation of Delphi was not just an archaeological project, it was a cultural event. Scholars from across Europe came to see the work in progress. The finds were reported in newspapers and scholarly journals. The fact that an entire ancient sanctuary had been buried beneath a modern village and then successfully excavated captured public imagination. Delphi became proof that the classical world described in texts really had existed, that the stories about oracles and games and treasuries full of gold were based in historical reality. The excavation helped establish archaeology as a serious scholarly discipline, demonstrating what could be learned from careful, systematic study of ancient sites. The work continued for decades. Successive seasons of excavation revealed more of the sanctuary and the ancient town that had surrounded it. Archaeologists found houses, shops, bath facilities, all the infrastructure of a settlement whose economy depended on serving pilgrims. They found evidence of the earthquakes that had damaged the site multiple times. They excavated the area around the temple's foundation, searching for the legendary chasm from which vapors rose. This search was less successful. No obvious fissure was found, leading some scholars to conclude that the vapors had been mythological. But later geological surveys would suggest that fault lines beneath the temple might have released gases intermittently, particularly after seismic activity. The mystery of how the oracle worked remained partially unsolved, hovering between natural explanation and ancient belief. The French Archaeological School, which led the excavation, published detailed reports on their findings. These publications became foundational texts for the study of Greek religion and archaeology. Plans were drawn of every structure. Inscriptions were photographed and translated. Pottery and other artifacts were catalogued and analyzed. The scholarly work transformed understanding of how Greek sanctuaries functioned, how they accumulated wealth, how they influenced politics and culture. Delphi became a case study, the best preserved and most thoroughly documented example of a major Greek religious site. Conservation and partial reconstruction followed excavation. The treasury of the Athenians was rebuilt using original stones that had collapsed but survived. Columns from the Temple of Apollo were re-erected, not to restore the temple completely but to give visitors a sense of its scale and grandeur. These reconstructions were controversial. Some scholars argued that ruins should be left as found, that reconstruction imposed modern interpretations on ancient structures. Others felt that carefully done reconstruction using only original materials and following clear evidence helped the public understand what the sanctuary had looked like. The debate continues in archaeology, but at Delphi, the limited reconstructions have become iconic, allowing visitors to visualize the ancient site more easily. The rediscovery of Delphi coincided with growing Greek national consciousness. For modern Greeks, the ancient sanctuary was proof of their cultural heritage, evidence that their ancestors had created one of the world's great civilizations. Delphi became a symbol of Greek identity, a source of national pride. The archaeological site was maintained and protected, eventually designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as having importance not just for Greece but for all humanity. The ruins became one of Greece's most visited tourist destinations, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, people from around the world who came to walk the sacred way and stand before Apollo's temple. The excavation and study of Delphi also raised questions that could not be fully answered. How exactly did the oracle work? What caused the Pythia's trance? Were the vapors real or symbolic? How were oracles crafted? How much was divine inspiration, and how much was priestly manipulation? These questions cannot be answered with certainty. The ancient sources are incomplete, and sometimes contradictory. The physical evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. What remains is a deeper mystery, the question of how an entire civilization could center so much of its religious and political life around a sanctuary where a woman sat in darkness and spoke words that were believed to come from a god. The excavation revealed the physical reality of Delphi, the stones and structures, but the spiritual reality, the lived experience of belief in the oracle, remains partially beyond the reach of archaeology. Modern visitors to Delphi walk through a site that is both ancient and reconstructed, both ruin and interpretation. The stones are real, worn by time and weather, carved and placed by ancient hands. But the context is modern, with paths and signs and museums, with tourists taking photographs, with guides explaining the history in multiple languages. The site exists in a strange temporality, simultaneously ancient and contemporary, a place where the past is visible, but mediated through present concerns and understanding. And yet something of the original power remains. The location is still dramatic. The cliffs still tower above. The view across the valley to the distant sea still takes your breath away. Walking the sacred way, even as a tourist, even knowing that no oracle will speak, you can feel why the ancients believed this place was special, was sacred, was the center of the world. And so we come to the end of our journey through Delphi, from its mythological origins to its rediscovery and preservation. We have walked the sacred way together, climbed from the entrance of the sanctuary past treasuries and monuments, past the great temple where the oracle spoke, up to the theater and stadium where athletes competed in the god's honor. We have stood at the Castalian Spring and felt its cold water. We have tried to understand what it meant to live in a world where divine prophecy was accepted reality, where a woman in trance could speak words that kings obeyed. We have traced the sanctuary's political power, its influence on colonization and warfare, its role as neutral ground where enemies could meet, and we have followed its decline, from the height of its prestige through gradual decay to final closure and centuries of forgetting. What remains of Delphi today? The stones remain, weathered but present. The foundations of Apollo's temple still mark the center of the sanctuary. Some columns stand re-erected, giving a sense of the building's former grandeur. The theater is intact enough that performances are occasionally held there even now, voices carrying across the stone seats just as they did 2,000 years ago. The stadium at the top of the sanctuary has been cleared and partially restored, its track visible, its stone starting blocks still in place. Walking these spaces, you can map the ancient site onto the modern ruins, can visualize the sacred way crowded with pilgrims, the temple filled with offerings, the stadium packed with spectators watching runners compete. The museum at Delphi houses treasures that survived burial and time. The charioteer stands in climate-controlled glory, his bronze patina green with age, his expression still calm after 2.5 millennia. Fragments of sculptural groups from the temple pediments are displayed, showing the extraordinary skill of classical Greek artists. There are inscriptions, thousands of them, recording dedications and decrees and oracle responses, primary sources that allow us to reconstruct aspects of how the sanctuary functioned. There are smaller objects too, votives dedicated by ordinary pilgrims, bronze figurines and ceramic vessels, proof that Delphi served not just kings and city-states, but common people seeking divine help with daily concerns. Beyond the physical remains, Delphi's legacy persists in ideas and principles that shaped Western civilization. The maxim "know thyself" continues to challenge people to self-examination and honesty about their limitations. The concept of seeking wisdom beyond human knowledge, of acknowledging that there are things we cannot know without help from sources greater than ourselves, remains part of religious and philosophical traditions. The oracle's method of speaking in riddles, of giving answers that require interpretation, has influenced how we think about prophecy and meaning. The ambiguity was not a flaw but a feature, a recognition that truth is complex and that divine wisdom might not translate easily into human certainty. Delphi also left a legacy in how we think about sacred spaces. The idea that certain places are special, are charged with meaning beyond their physical characteristics, remains powerful. People still travel to sites associated with religious or historical significance, seeking connection to something larger than themselves. Pilgrimage, the journey to a sacred place with questions or needs, remains a human practice across cultures and religions. Delphi was perhaps the most famous pilgrimage site of the ancient Greek world, and its model, a difficult journey to a dramatic location to seek wisdom or blessing, echoes in pilgrimage traditions worldwide. The sanctuary's political role also left lessons about the relationship between religion and power. Delphi demonstrated how religious authority could transcend political boundaries, how a neutral sacred space could provide common ground for warring states. The Amphictyonic League, the coalition that protected Delphi, was an early attempt at international organization based on shared religious commitment. While the League ultimately failed to prevent Greek city-states from fighting each other, it demonstrated that religion could create bonds that cut across political divisions. This idea, that sacred commitments can unite otherwise separate groups, has influenced political thought about the role of shared values in building communities and nations. The oracle's decline also teaches something important. No institution, no matter how prestigious or influential, lasts forever. The world changes, beliefs shift, and what once seemed essential becomes obsolete. Delphi served Greek civilization for 1,000 years, shaping its culture in profound ways. But when the world changed, when Christianity replaced paganism, when rational philosophy challenged divine prophecy, Delphi could not adapt. The oracle that had answered so many questions could not answer the question of its own relevance in a new age. The silence that fell on the sanctuary in 393 CE was final. No amount of prestige or accumulated wealth could prevent the inevitable end when the cultural conditions that sustained the oracle disappeared. Yet in its end lies a different kind of preservation. Because the oracle stopped speaking when it did. Because the sanctuary was abandoned and eventually buried, it was protected from further change. Roman or Byzantine Christians did not transform Apollo's temple into a church, as happened to many pagan sites. The structures were not continuously modified and rebuilt for new purposes. Instead, they were left to decay and be covered by earth, creating a kind of time capsule. When archaeologists excavated Delphi, they found a sanctuary that, while damaged by earthquakes and looting, still reflected its ancient arrangement. The sacred way still climbed the mountain. The treasuries still stood where cities had built them. The theater and stadium were in their original locations. This accidental preservation allows modern visitors to experience something close to the original layout, to walk paths that ancient pilgrims walked, to see a sacred landscape that has not been fundamentally altered by subsequent use. Standing in the ruins today, particularly at dawn or dusk when the tourist crowds are absent, you can still feel something of what drew ancient pilgrims here. The light on the stones has not changed. The mountain still looms above. The valley still spreads below, olive trees silvering in the breeze. The Castalian Spring still flows cold and pure between the cliffs. The physical setting that made this place feel sacred remains largely unchanged. What is gone is the living belief, the active worship, the Pythia sitting on her tripod, the priests interpreting her words, the suppliants waiting nervously for oracles that would shape their lives. Those human elements, the spiritual reality of Delphi, exist now only in imagination, in attempts to reconstruct from texts and artifacts what it felt like to believe absolutely in the oracle's divine authority. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is fitting that we can visit the place but cannot fully recover the experience. The ancient world is distant from us, separated not just by time but by fundamental differences in how we understand reality. They believed gods spoke to mortals through oracles. We study those beliefs as cultural phenomena, interesting but not convincing in the way they were convincing to the Greeks. The gap is unbridgeable. We can walk where they walked, stand where they stood, see what they saw, but we cannot believe as they believed. And that distance, that inability to fully enter their mindset, is a reminder that the past is truly past, that we can study it and honor it, but never entirely possess it. Yet Delphi endures in memory and in influence. The sanctuary may be ruins, but the ideas it represented remain vital. The search for wisdom, the recognition that human knowledge is limited, the value of self-examination, the power of sacred spaces, these concepts originated in places like Delphi and continue to shape how we think and live. The oracle is silent, but her maxims still speak. Know thyself, nothing in excess. These words, carved in stone on a temple wall 25 centuries ago, remain as relevant and challenging today as when they were first inscribed. They remind us that some wisdom is timeless, that the questions ancient Greeks asked about how to live well are the same questions we still struggle with. Delphi's story is ultimately about the relationship between mortals and mysteries. It is about the human need to believe that we can access knowledge beyond what our senses and reason provide. It is about the search for meaning in a world that often seems random and incomprehensible. The ancient Greeks created a system where divine wisdom could be consulted, where the boundary between mortal and divine could be crossed, where questions could be asked and answers, however cryptic, could be received. That system no longer functions. The gods, if they ever spoke at Delphi, are silent now. The oracle is gone, but the ruins remain as testament to the power of that belief, to the lengths humans will go to connect with something greater than themselves, to the enduring hope that the mysteries can be understood, or at least approached, if we know where to look and how to ask. And now our journey ends. The dawn has come fully. The light touches the ruins, warming the stone, illuminating the ancient paths. We have wandered through centuries, from Delphi's mythological origins to its discovery and excavation. We have tried to understand what this place meant to those who built it, who walked its sacred way, who consulted its oracle, who competed in its games. We have stood among stones that have outlasted empires, that bear witness to beliefs we can study but never fully recapture. The sanctuary is quiet now, save for the wind and the occasional voice of a tourist guide. The Pythia will not speak again. The games will not be held. The pilgrims will not come seeking prophecy. But the place endures, beautiful and enigmatic, a window into an ancient world that shaped our own in ways we are still discovering. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. May you carry something of Delphi's wisdom with you, the call to know yourself, to seek moderation, to acknowledge the limits of human understanding while still pursuing knowledge and meaning. The ancient world has much to teach us, if we approach it with humility and curiosity. And places like Delphi, ruins though they may be, continue to speak to anyone willing to listen, to stand among the stones and feel the weight of centuries, to imagine what it meant to believe in oracles, and to ask the eternal questions that connect us across time. Sleep well, and dream of ancient wisdom whispered on mountain winds, of sacred springs and fallen temples, of the eternal human search for answers to mysteries that perhaps have no final answer, only endless wonder.